The smoke over Garden Valley had turned the color of a bruise by the time my engine crested the last ridge. Orange and low and wrong, the kind of light that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. Through the haze, I could just make out a hand-carved wooden sign at the end of a locked gravel road, 40 years old. It was nailed up by a man who never once imagined his own family would be the reason a fire crew had to cut through his gate to reach him. My name is Sloane Radke. I am 36 years old, and I run a wildland fire engine crew out of the Boise district. I have pulled a lot of people out of a lot of bad situations in 14 years of this work. But I never expected to be running lights and sirens toward my own uncle's front porch, screaming his name into a radio he had been ignoring for 6 straight hours. 6 weeks earlier, at my grandfather's memorial lunch, that same uncle had leaned across a folding table and told the whole family, again, that chasing fires for a living was not a real job. It was just something I did instead of growing up. He did not know, standing at that locked gate, with the whole mountain behind him turning the color of a furnace, that the captain ordering him out was the niece he had spent his whole life underestimating. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Before I get into it, if stories like this one matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps a small channel like mine reach the people who need to hear it. And tell me in the comments, honestly, whether you have ever had someone in your family dismiss the one thing you were actually the best in the room at. I read every single one. All right, let's go back to the beginning. My family has owned a small mountain property in the Boise National Forest foothills, near a town called Garden Valley, since 1961. My grandfather, Silas Radke, built the first cabin there with his own 2 hands, back when the road in was barely a road at all, just 2 ruts and a hope. He was not a wealthy man when he built it. He worked construction jobs all winter in Boise and drove up to Garden Valley every spare weekend for 2 full years, hauling lumber up that unfinished road, by hand whenever his truck could not make the grade. He used to tell me the whole property was never meant to make anyone money. It was meant to give his kids and grandkids one place in the world that stayed exactly the same while everything else changed around them. I think about that sentence often now, given everything that happened later. I do not believe Wade set out to betray that vision on purpose. I think he simply let 18 months of investor calls and closing dates slowly convince him the land's real value was the number on a purchase agreement, rather than the thing my grandfather actually built it to hold. Over the decades, that one cabin grew into 6, plus a lodge house with a stone fireplace big enough to stand inside. Every summer of my childhood, every single one, our whole extended family gathered there for 2 straight weeks in July. I loved that property with my whole chest as a kid. The pine smell, the cold creek, the way my grandfather sat on the porch every evening and watched the tree line like it was a television program only he understood. I was 9 years old, the first time I watched a hotshot crew work a small lightning fire on the ridge above our cabins. I remember standing at the fence line in my pajamas at 2 in the morning, watching a line of headlamps move through smoke like something out of a dream I had not had yet. My grandfather stood next to me that night. He did not tell me to go back to bed, and he did not tell me it was too dangerous to watch. He just said, quietly, that those people up on the ridge were doing the most honest work he had ever seen a human being do, protecting something without being asked to, and without expecting anyone to thank them for it. I did not understand yet that he had just handed me the whole shape of my future in one sentence on a dark porch at 9 years old. But I never once forgot it. My Uncle Wade is my father's younger brother, 12 years older than me. After my grandfather's health started declining, in my early 20s, Wade took over running the property full-time. He turned it from a family gathering place into a small seasonal lodge business, renting cabins to hunters and hikers, and eventually to weekend tourists driving up from Boise for the mountain view. He was good at the business side of it, genuinely good, and I want to be fair to him before I tell you the rest of this. He kept the roof sound and the water system working and the books, for years, more or less balanced. He is not a cartoon villain in this story. He is a man who made a series of choices, and I am going to show you exactly what those choices cost. What Wade was never good at, not once in 16 years, was taking my career seriously. I went to the fire academy at 19, and at the very next family gathering he asked me, in front of both my parents and my grandfather, when I was planning to get a real job. I said fighting fire was a real job. He laughed, not unkindly exactly, more like the laugh you give a kid who says she wants to be an astronaut. He told me it was fine as a phase, but eventually I would need to settle into something with an actual future. I was 19. I did not yet have the words to explain that a captain on a hotshot crew makes life-or-death tactical calls on burning terrain with less sleep and less margin for error than almost any job he could name. So I just said, sure, and let it go, because that is what you learn to do at 19, when a grown man 12 years older than you decides who you are. That sentence, or some close cousin of it, followed me for the next 16 years. At my younger cousin's wedding, Wade introduced me to a table of strangers as the one who runs off and plays firefighter every summer. At my grandfather's 80th birthday, he told a story about a hunting client who had asked whether the property had fire coverage. Wade said, and I am quoting him exactly, "Don't worry, my niece chases fires for a living, so if this place ever burns down, at least somebody in the family will show up." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because that is also a thing you learn to do. My grandfather did not laugh that particular time. He caught my eye across the table and held it and said nothing, because he had learned by then that saying something rarely changed Wade's mind about anything at all. I want to give you one more specific example, because it is easier to understand a 16-year pattern through one dinner than through a vague description of many. 3 years ago, at Thanksgiving, my cousin's husband, new enough to the family that he did not yet know the rules, asked me what a typical week on a hotshot crew actually looked like. I started to answer, genuinely glad someone had asked, describing the physical fitness test and the specific weight of the gear we carry up a slope. Wade cut in before I finished my second sentence, laughing, and said, "Careful, she'll talk your ear off about her little camping trips." The table laughed with him, the way tables do. My cousin's husband looked confused for a second, the way people do, when they sense they have stumbled into an old family joke without the context for it. Then he let it go, the way everyone at that table always let it go. I excused myself to the kitchen a few minutes later, under the excuse of refilling a water pitcher, and stood at the sink for exactly as long as it took to compose my face again. My grandfather found me there. He did not say anything about Wade directly. He just squeezed my shoulder once, the way he always did when words felt insufficient to him, and said, "They'll understand eventually, Sloan, or they won't, and either way you keep doing the work." I have thought about that sink and that squeeze more times than I can count. I built my actual career during those same 16 years, quietly, the way you build anything that matters, one unglamorous season at a time. I spent my first 4 years on a Forest Service engine crew out of McCall, learning terrain and fuel behavior, and the particular discipline of staying calm while the wind changes direction on you without warning. I made hotshot crew at 26, one of only a handful of women on our unit that season. I want to be honest, I did not make it because anyone handed me anything. I made it because I ran the same physical test as every man on that crew and passed it. Then I spent 2 more years proving I could carry a chainsaw up a slope at 7,000 feet and still think clearly when a spot fire jumped the line behind me. My second season on that crew, we spent 9 days on a fire outside Salmon that jumped containment twice in 1 week and pushed all of us past exhaustion in a way I had not experienced before. One night, our superintendent split us into 2 squads to hold a ridge neither of us fully trusted, and I drew the steeper pitch, with 3 crew members I had known for less than a season. We held that line until 4 in the morning, black with soot, radios crackling with spot fire reports every few minutes. When the sun finally came up, our superintendent walked the ridge himself and told us flatly that we had done work he would put against any crew in the region. I remember standing there, exhausted past the point of words, feeling something settle into place in my chest that I still carry today. Nobody in my family ever heard that story, not once in all these years. I never told it, because by then I had learned that telling it would only earn me another comment about phases and real jobs. So I kept it quietly, the way you keep the things that actually matter to you, folded away where nobody could reach in and diminish them. I made engine captain at 30. I have run my own crew out of the Boise district for 6 years now, which means I am the person other captains call when a fire gets complicated enough that nobody wants to make the call alone. None of that, not one piece of it, ever made it into a single conversation at a single family dinner. I called my parents every week, the way you do, and told them about my seasons in the vaguest possible terms, because I had learned that specifics just gave Wade more material to work with. My father, Hugh, is a quieter man than his brother, and I think some part of him was proud of me, though he rarely said so directly. I think another part of him simply never fully understood what I actually did for a living, the way a person can love you and still not quite see the shape of your days. The fire that actually taught me what captaincy means happened in my second season running my own engine crew on a ridge above a small subdivision outside Emmett. We arrived to find a wall of flame moving faster than our initial size-up had predicted. I made the call, in about 4 seconds, to pull my crew off a structure we could not save, and reposition to protect the 6 homes behind it instead. That decision meant one house burned that might have survived with a different call, and 5 others stood the next morning that would not have. I have replayed those 4 seconds more times than I can count, the way you replay any decision, That costs something no matter which way you make it. My battalion chief told me afterward it was the correct call, and I believed him, and I still believe him now. But correct and easy are not the same thing, and nobody who has not stood on that kind of ridge really understands the difference. That is the job, in full, the quiet weight of decisions nobody else ever sees you make. And it is the exact job my uncle spent 16 years calling a phase. My grandfather understood. He was the only one who ever asked me real questions about fire behavior and crew dynamics, and about what it actually felt like to stand your ground on a piece of burning terrain. I answered every single one of them like they mattered, because to him, they did. My grandfather died 2 years ago, in March, at 89 years old, in his sleep, in the lodge house he built with his own hands. At his memorial, held right there on the property because that is where he would have wanted it, Wade stood up and gave a lovely speech about legacy and family and carrying the torch forward. Afterward, over folding tables loaded with casserole dishes, he found me by the creek and told me, again, that it was a shame I never found time for a real career. Dad, he said, would have loved to see me settle down closer to home. I did not argue with him. I stopped arguing with him a long time ago. I just said I had a fire season starting in 3 weeks and walked back to my truck and drove the 4 hours home to Boise with my jaw tight the whole way. What Wade did not tell the rest of the family, that same week, was that he had quietly put the entire property under contract with a regional developer named Renee Castillo. Her group planned to convert our family's 6 cabins and the 40 acres around them into a boutique resort with 12 new units and a spa building. The sale price was substantial, more money than any of us had ever discussed out loud. Wade had structured the whole deal himself, quietly, over 18 months, without a single family meeting, and without a single phone call to my father, who still technically co-owned a third of the property under our grandfather's original trust. I only learned the actual shape of that pitch much later, from documents the county subpoenaed during its review, but it explains exactly how far along the deal already was by the time the fire started. Renee Castillo's firm had already commissioned architectural renderings of the finished resort, complete with a spa building where our old equipment shed used to stand. The whole project even had a name, Cinder Ridge Lodge, one that would strike almost everyone in my family as a small, ugly joke once the actual fire came through. Wade had walked 4 separate groups of investors through the property over the previous year, always scheduling the tour for clear, calm days. He always steered conversation away from the property's wildfire history, which, given where it sits, is not a short history to steer around. The closing date, 9 weeks out when I first saw the paperwork, had already slipped twice before that, each time because some detail of the financing needed another round of review. Wade, by the account of people who worked with him during that period, had grown increasingly anxious about a third delay. A single afternoon's walkthrough, scheduled weeks in advance with people who had flown in specifically for it, felt to him like something worth protecting at any cost. I found out about the sale by accident, the way you find out about most things people would rather you did not know. My father mentioned it, almost in passing, during one of our weekly calls, saying Wade had asked him to sign some paperwork transferring his share. Wade had assured him it was just a formality tied to the estate settlement. I asked my father to send me a photo of it before he signed anything, out of nothing more than professional caution, the same caution I bring to every fireline briefing. What he sent me was not an estate settlement document at all. It was a purchase agreement with Renee Castillo's development company named as the buyer, and a closing date exactly 9 weeks out. I called my father back within the hour. I told him, as gently as I could, that he was about to sign away his share of Grandpa's land into a resort deal his own brother had never once mentioned to him directly. My father went quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I will not forget, that he supposed Wade had simply assumed nobody else really cared about the property the way he did. I told him that was not true, that I cared, that I had spent every summer of my childhood on that land, and that caring quietly is not the same thing as not caring at all. My father did not sign the paperwork that week. Wade, by every account, was furious. The trouble that actually matters in this story started 3 weeks later, in the middle of an unusually dry August, when a lightning strike ignited a small fire in steep, brushy terrain about 6 miles from the property. Our unit had been watching that drainage nervously for days already, because of low humidity and strong, unpredictable afternoon winds. I was not initially assigned to that fire. I was working a different incident 40 miles north. I only learned about the Garden Valley fire the way most captains learn about a growing incident, through dispatch chatter, crossing our shared radio channel while we refueled engines at a staging area. I remember exactly where I was standing when I heard the road name, at a dusty staging area 40 miles north, next to a crew member named Tobias, who has worked my engine for 3 seasons. He noticed my face change before I said a word, because that is the kind of thing you learn to read in a person you have worked 14-hour days beside for years. I told him quietly that the fire crossing our shared channel was burning 6 miles from my family's property, and he did not ask any follow-up questions. He just said, "Go talk to Alvarado," and started topping off the tank himself, so I would not lose the 10 minutes it would take. That is a small thing in the scope of everything else in this story. But I think about it often, because it is the kind of quiet competence nobody in my family has ever once thought to ask me about. It is the kind that exists on every fire line in this country, and rarely gets a single sentence of recognition beyond the people who actually do the work. I recognized the road name the second I heard it, because it was the exact gravel road my grandfather had carved by hand 60 years earlier. My stomach dropped in a way I have only felt a handful of times in 14 years of this work. I asked our division's supervisor, a steady, no-nonsense woman named Deacon Alvarado, whether my crew could be reassigned to the Garden Valley perimeter, and I told her plainly that I had family property directly in the projected path. She looked at me for a second, the way commanders do when they are deciding whether personal stakes make a captain sharper or more dangerous. Then she said, "Fine, but you run this exactly like any other assignment, Radk, no exceptions." I told her I would. I meant it, and I want you to remember that I meant it, because it matters enormously for what happens next in this story. Deacon Alvarado has run incident command in this district for 11 years, and she has a reputation, well earned, for pulling captains off assignments the moment personal stakes start clouding their judgment. She did not pull me. I have thought about that decision often since, because it would have been the easy, defensible call. Instead, she trusted me to hold the same line. I ask every captain under me to hold, even with my own family's cabins sitting inside the projected fire perimeter. I do not think she trusted me because we are close. We are not particularly close. We simply respect each other's judgment. I think she trusted me because respect built over 11 years of watching someone work is not the same thing as affection, and it does not need affection to be real. While my crew was still 40 minutes out, County Emergency Management issued a mandatory evacuation order for the entire Garden Valley drainage, our family's road included, based on wind forecasts predicting the fire would double in size within hours. That order went out over emergency alert systems, over local radio, and through a reverse 911 system that dials every registered phone number in the affected zone. Wade's number was on that list. So was the property's landline. Both were called, and both calls were logged with timestamps by the county system, a detail that matters enormously later in this story. Hold on to it now, the same way I held onto that porch sentence from my grandfather all those years ago. Wade did not evacuate. Renee Castillo, the developer's representative, happened to be on the property that exact afternoon for a scheduled investor walkthrough, timed deliberately before the closing date. Wade, by his own later account, did not want to cancel it. He told Renee the smoke was routine for the area this time of year, that the county always evacuated earlier than necessary, and that he had personally watched fires burn through this valley before, without ever once reaching the cabins. He was not entirely wrong about the valley's history. He was catastrophically wrong about this particular fire, on this particular afternoon, with this particular wind. Here is a detail I need to give you, because it is the one that still catches in my chest every single time I tell this story. The property's caretaker, a soft-spoken woman named Miriam who has worked for our family for 9 years, called the county sheriff's non-emergency line that same afternoon. She was worried, and she wanted to ask whether the evacuation order truly applied to their specific road. The dispatcher who took that call recorded it as a matter of routine county policy. On that recording, Miriam can be heard asking Wade directly, in the background, whether they should be leaving. Wade's voice, caught clearly on that same recording, says, "We're fine. Tell them we're fine. I've got people here for the sale." I want to sit with that sentence for a second, because it took me weeks after the fact to understand its full weight. I've got people here for the sale. Not, I've checked the fire behavior and I'm confident in our defensible space. Not, I've spoken to an official and they've told me the risk is low. Just, I've got people here for the sale, spoken to a caretaker frightened enough to call the sheriff's office and ask a stranger whether her employer's judgment could still be trusted. My crew arrived at the base of the access road just after 4 in the afternoon, with visible flame now cresting the ridge above the cabins, and the wind gusting hard enough to bend small trees sideways. The main gate to the property, a heavy iron gate my grandfather had installed decades earlier, after a string of trespassing incidents, was closed and padlocked. It was blocking not just casual traffic, but our engine, at the exact moment every single second mattered. I radioed dispatch the gate code we had on file from an old easement agreement, and it did not work because Wade, without telling anyone, had changed the lock 2 years earlier. It had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with keeping the developer's surveyors from wandering the property unescorted before closing. We cut the lock because that is exactly what training exists for. My crew pushed the gate open by hand while the engine idled behind us, embers already raining down through the smoke like a wrong kind of snow. I ran the last quarter-mile up the gravel drive myself, ahead of the engine, because I knew that road, every rut and washout of it, better than any of the younger crew members with me. The heat on that drive is not something I can adequately describe to someone who has not stood inside an active wildfire perimeter. It presses against exposed skin like a physical hand. And the sound is not the crackling you hear from a campfire. It is a low, constant roar, closer to a jet engine than to anything you would call fire in casual conversation. I have run toward that sound more times than I can count in 14 years, and it never stops registering, somewhere low in my chest, as something no sane person should be running toward. I ran toward it anyway, that afternoon, the same way I have run toward it every other time, because somewhere on the other side of that sound was a person who needed someone to come get him. It did not matter, in that exact moment, that the person was my uncle. That is the moment my hook found me, standing at the porch of the lodge house my grandfather built. I was screaming a name into my radio mic that my own family had spent 16 years telling me not to take too seriously. Wade came out onto the porch when he heard the engine. For one full second, maybe two, he looked directly at me in full turnout gear, helmet on, face shield down, radio in hand, and did not recognize me at all. I understand why now. He had never once, in 16 years, actually pictured what I looked like doing my job. He had only ever pictured the phrase he used to describe it: chasing fires, playing firefighter, a phase, and none of those phrases came with an actual face attached to them. I pulled my face shield up so he could see me clearly. I watched something in his expression genuinely break, the way a person's face changes when a joke he has been telling for years suddenly, without warning, becomes real in front of him. I did not have time, in that moment, to say a single word about 16 years of comments at family dinners. I had exactly 90 seconds to get him, Renee Castillo, and Miriam into my engine, before the wind shift my supervisor had warned us about arrived early. I told him, flatly, in the exact voice I use with every civilian on every fire line, that this was a mandatory evacuation, that he needed to move right now. We were leaving in 90 seconds, whether he was in the vehicle or not. He did not argue. He did not have it in him, in that moment, to argue with the person standing directly between him and the fire. He simply nodded and moved faster than I had ever once seen him move in my life. Renee Castillo, to her credit, did not need to be told twice. She grabbed her laptop bag out of pure reflex and nothing else, leaving behind a leather portfolio of renderings and contracts that would later burn along with the equipment shed, and climbed into my engine without a single question. She told me afterward, in a brief conversation at the county's request during the investigation, that she had raised the evacuation warning with Wade twice, that afternoon before I arrived. Both times, he had told her it was fine, that he knew this land better than any county official ever could. She said she wished, looking back, that she had simply left on her own the first time she asked, instead of trusting a property owner's confidence over her own read of the smoke outside the window. I do not think she was lying when she said that. I think she was doing the same thing all of us do sometimes, deferring to a person who sounds certain, even when some quieter part of you already knows better. Here is a question I want to ask you before I tell you what happened after we got everyone down safely. Have you ever had a moment where someone who spent years dismissing your competence had to trust it completely, with no time left to pretend otherwise? Tell me about it in the comments, honestly, because I think almost everyone watching this has some version of that story sitting quietly in their own chest. I read every single one, usually the same night I post this. All right, let me tell you what happened once we were all safely down the mountain. We got Wade, Renee, and Miriam into the engine and down the access road with less than 4 minutes to spare. The wind shift my supervisor had predicted arrived right after, pushing the fire hard against the exact hillside behind the cabins. My crew worked defensible space around the lodge house for the next 2 hours, clearing brush and wetting down the roofline. Through a combination of skill and plain luck, the main lodge and 2 of the 6 cabins survived the night. The other 4 did not. Wade watched all of it from a safety perimeter a 1/4 mile down the road. Wrapped in a foil emergency blanket one of my crew members had handed him, saying almost nothing for 3 straight hours. I want to tell you honestly what I felt, standing at that perimeter, checking on my crew between assignments, glancing over at my uncle wrapped in a blanket he never expected to need. I felt real, complicated relief that he was alive, because whatever else is true, he is my father's brother, and I have loved him my whole life in the plain, uncomplicated way you love family. I also felt something harden in me at the same time, because relief that a person survived does not erase the fact that he nearly did not, over a real estate closing date. Both of those things were true in me at once, standing on that road, and I have stopped expecting them to cancel each other out. The county fire investigation that followed, standard procedure for any incident involving a delayed or refused evacuation, pulled the sheriff's dispatch recording as a matter of routine, along with the reverse 911 logs showing exactly when Wade's number had been notified. None of that was my doing, and I did not need it to be. A near miss involving a locked gate and a refused evacuation order triggers an automatic county review in Idaho. The same way, a hip fracture from an unattended fall triggers one in a hospital. The review found exactly what the recording had already made plain, that the property owner received timely, repeated warning, and chose, for reasons entirely his own, to disregard every single one of them. 3 weeks after the fire, the county held a public town hall for residents of the burn zone, a routine part of the recovery process. Officials walk affected families through what happened, what resources are available, and what went wrong, so the same mistakes are not repeated the next fire season. Miriam sat in the second row that night. So did my father. So, reluctantly, did Wade. A county fire official played the dispatch recording aloud for the room, as an example of exactly the kind of decision that endangers not just one family, but the crews sent in to save them. Every person in that room heard Wade's own voice say, "We're fine. Tell them we're fine. I've got people here for the sale." Miriam found me in the parking lot afterward, and I want to tell you what she said, because it has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that whole month. She told me she had spent 9 years working for a man she genuinely liked. Hearing his own voice dismiss her fear so completely had cost her something she was not sure she would get back, a kind of trust she had extended without ever fully examining it. She also told me she did not regret making that call to the sheriff's office, not for 1 second. It meant there was a record, a timestamp, a version of that afternoon nobody could later reshape into something gentler than it actually was. I told her I thought that took real courage, picking up a phone to question a man who signs your paycheck. She said it did not feel like courage in the moment, it just felt like the only thing she could live with afterward. I have thought about that distinction often since, the gap between what courage feels like while you are doing it, and what it looks like from the outside once the danger has passed. I was not the one who played that recording, and I want to be clear about that, because I know how this story could sound if I let it. I was 3 rows back, in civilian clothes for once, sitting next to my father. I watched my uncle's face while a room full of his neighbors heard, in his own voice, exactly what he had chosen to prioritize over their safety and over his own. Nobody in that room needed me to say a single word. The recording said all of it, in his own voice, without me lifting a finger. Wade did not speak to me for almost 3 weeks after that town hall. When he finally called, it was a short, awkward conversation, and he did not use the whole word sorry, though he came close. He said he had spent 3 weeks replaying that night in his head, over and over. The version of himself, who told a frightened caretaker he had people there for the sale, was not a version he recognized or particularly wanted to keep being. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I did not tell him it fixed 16 years of family dinners in one phone call, because it did not. I have learned that some repairs happen slowly, in small pieces, rather than all at once, in a single conversation. My father called me the week after Wade did, and his conversation with me went differently, in a way I want to describe honestly because it matters to how this story actually ended. He did not apologize for Wade, and he did not make excuses for him either. He simply asked me, plainly, whether I had known, before that afternoon, that my career would ever actually matter to this family, in a way nobody could argue with. I told him the truth, that I had stopped needing it to matter to anyone but myself a long time ago, sometime around my 2nd season on Hotshot Crew. Waiting on validation that never arrived was slowly costing me something I could not afford to keep losing. My father went quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then he said he was sorry it had taken almost losing his own brother, for that brother to see what had apparently been obvious to everyone else the whole time. I told him I appreciated that, and I meant it, though I also told him an apology on my behalf, from a person who was not the one who needed to give it, only carries so much weight. He said he understood that completely, and for the first time in a long time, I believed he actually did. The developer's deal fell through entirely. Not because of anything I did, but because a burned property with an open county investigation attached to it is simply not the asset Renee Castillo's investors had agreed to buy. Wade lost the sale and lost 4 of the 6 cabins and gained, slowly, over the following months, something I think mattered to him more than either of those losses once the shock finally wore off. He started asking me real questions, for the first time in 16 years, about fire behavior and defensible space, and about what an actual evacuation order requires of a property owner. He rebuilt 2 of the 4 lost cabins himself, the following spring, with proper fire-resistant materials this time, and clearance he never once bothered with before. He has not, to my knowledge, called what I do a phase since that night on the mountain. Renee Castillo, for her part, sent Wade a short letter a few months later, releasing him from any further obligation under the original agreement and wishing his family well. I read that letter once at Wade's kitchen table because he wanted me to see it. It was more gracious than I expected from someone who had just lost a substantial deal, and I asked Wade why he thought she had bothered writing it at all. He said she had told him, on the phone, that watching a locked gate nearly cost 3 people their lives had reminded her why she got into this work in the first place. She wanted to build places people actually wanted to live, not to chase a closing date at any cost. I do not know if that changed how she runs her business going forward. I know it changed how Wade talks about her, and about that whole summer. I think that alone was worth more, to our family, than the sale ever would have been. My father and Wade have repaired their share of the property trust, slowly, with an actual attorney involved this time, instead of a folding table conversation. My grandfather's lodge house still stands exactly where he built it. I still drive up there every summer, the way I did as a kid, and sit on that same porch in the evening and watch the tree line the way he taught me to. Wade sits with me sometimes now, quietly. I think some part of him finally understands what my grandfather understood on that porch all those years ago, that the work of protecting something, quietly, without being thanked for it, is the most honest work a person can do. The following July, for the first time in 3 years, our whole extended family gathered at the property again, spread across the 2 surviving cabins and the lodge house, the way we used to be spread across 6. It was smaller and quieter, and everyone felt the gap where 4 cabins used to stand. But it was also, in a way I had not expected, more honest than any gathering I could remember from the years before. Nobody made a joke that summer about my job being a phase. My Aunt Paulette, Wade's wife, pulled me aside on the second night and told me she had listened to the recording from the town hall 3 separate times since it happened. She still could not quite reconcile the man on that recording with the man she had married 30 years earlier. I told her I understood, because I had spent weeks doing the exact same thing with my own memory of him. We sat on the porch together for a long while after that, not saying much, just watching the same tree line my grandfather used to watch. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence between us felt like something closer to peace than something we were both quietly enduring. Before I get to what all of this actually taught me, I want to tell you one more small thing, because it is the detail I come back to most. Last summer, the first full season after the fire, Wade asked if he could come along on one of my prescribed burn training days, just to watch. He stood at the edge of the unit the whole afternoon, quiet, the way I used to stand at the fence line as a kid. Afterward, He told me he finally understood what my grandfather had tried to tell him for years. This work is not a phase anyone grows out of. It is a discipline a person grows into, one season at a time. I did not need him to say it, but I will not pretend it did not mean something, hearing it after 16 years of the opposite. A few months after that prescribed burn day, Wade drove the 4 hours to Boise on his own, unannounced, and asked if he could see where I actually worked. I gave him the full tour, the engine bay, the gear room, the board where we track crew certifications and physical test scores. He read every name on that board slowly, the way you read something you are trying to actually understand, rather than something you are trying to get through. He asked Tobias, unprompted, what it was like working under me. Tobias told him plainly that I was the captain he trusted most on the district, the one he would want, running his engine on the worst night of his career. I watched Wade's face while Tobias said that, and I watched him do the same math he had done on that porch, connecting a stranger's honest, unprompted praise to the niece he had spent 16 years reducing to a phase. He did not say much on the drive back that evening, according to my father, who spoke to him that same night. But he called me 2 days later and told me, plainly, that he was proud of me and that he was sorry it had taken this long and this much for him to actually say it out loud. I think about my grandfather often when I think about how this all ended. He built that property to be one fixed point in a family that would otherwise drift, the way families do, toward whatever the next generation happens to value most. He could not have predicted a wildfire, and he could not have predicted a development deal. But I think he understood something true about his own younger son, something that took the rest of us 16 years and one terrifying afternoon to fully understand ourselves. Wade has always measured his own worth by what he could build and close and finish, rather than by what he could simply protect for its own sake. I do not think that makes him a bad man. I think it makes him a man who needed, eventually, to stand on a mountain and watch 4 cabins burn before he could finally understand the difference between those two things. I got to learn that difference on a dark porch at 9 years old from a man who never once needed anything from me except my attention. Wade had to learn it at 52, in a foil blanket, watching his own choices burn down the hill in front of him. I am grateful, more than I can easily say, that he got the chance to learn it at all. Here is what 14 years of this work, and one terrifying afternoon on my own family's mountain, actually taught me, and I want to leave these with you plainly. Cutting corners to protect a deal always costs more than the deal was ever worth. Wade risked 3 lives and lost 4 cabins and lost the entire sale, trying to save one afternoon's worth of investor confidence. None of that math ever adds up in the direction people hope it will when they are making the choice. If you find yourself deciding whether to protect a person or protect a transaction, the transaction will always, eventually, show you exactly how little it was worth protecting in the first place. A person can spend 16 years dismissing your competence, and still, in the moment his life actually depends on it, trust you completely, without a second thought. That contradiction does not erase the years of dismissal, but it does tell you something true underneath them, that the doubt was never really about your ability. It was about a story he needed to keep telling himself. Before you let years of being underestimated define how you see yourself, Remember that the person doing the underestimating rarely has the full picture, and sometimes does not even believe his own words as much as he claims to. I spent 16 years believing that Wade's dismissal was a verdict, some final, settled judgment about who I was and what I was worth. It was never a verdict. It was a story a frightened, ordinary man kept telling himself, because the alternative, admitting he had misjudged someone for 16 years, was harder for him to hold than the dismissal itself ever was. Warnings exist because someone, somewhere, already paid the price of learning what happens when they are ignored. A mandatory evacuation order is not bureaucratic caution. It is the accumulated knowledge of every fire that came before it, handed to you for free. Refusing it, because you have a meeting to keep, is one of the most expensive decisions a person can make, without ever meaning to. Listen to the people whose entire job is knowing the thing you are choosing not to know. You can hold someone accountable for a genuinely dangerous choice, and still show up to pull him out of the fire he started. Those two things are not in tension, whatever anyone tells you. I filed no complaint against my uncle because the county's own investigation did that work honestly and completely, and I still climbed the exact hill his choices put him on, in full gear, and got him out myself. Accountability and love are allowed to occupy the same afternoon, the same porch, the same family, without one canceling out the other. The room, or the ridge, or the road a person is standing on, when the truth finally reaches him, rarely looks like the room you imagined delivering it in. I spent 16 years picturing the moment I might finally get to say, out loud, that my work mattered. I never once pictured it happening through a face shield, on a locked gravel road, with 4 minutes left before a wind shift. The truth does not wait for a tidy room. It arrives exactly when it has to, in whatever room you happen to be standing in. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about the moment someone in your life finally saw what you had been all along. I read every single one. Subscribe if you want another true story like this one. It starts with a woman finding a locked door with her own name on the deed behind it.